Brought to you by Telehelping, a virtual assistant staffing company for professionals.
Hello, everybody. My name is Cody Hall, and I am the host of The Faces, Entrepreneurs Are People Too, and the founding CEO of Telehelping, a virtual staffing corporation, and the herein sponsor of my podcast. So I appreciate you so much for Telehelping, for allowing me the opportunity to talk to great people like Irina this morning. Irina, how are you?
Hi, doing great, Cody. How are you?
We're both trying to beat the heat, as there seems to be a heat wave moving across the entire North America right now. But I'm not struggling as much, apparently, as Chicago is, right?
Yeah, we've got a strong heat wave that came through over the last couple of weeks, but it is summertime. So, Chicagoans who complain about summer heat shouldn't be complaining about the winter cold. That's how I see it. Yeah.
That's so great. My brother is a police officer in the United States, and he said yesterday, he's like, I don't care how fast someone's driving down the highway right now. I'm not getting out of my car. All right. And he's in the Southeast, so I can only imagine if it must be hot everywhere right now. But we'll try to keep it cool on the podcast here. And, and I generally like to start off by saying, like, who are we chatting with today? Why don't you take an opportunity to introduce yourself, your organization, and the human side of you to the folks listening today?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, Cody, for having me on. I'm really excited to be here and to share some of my background and wisdom with your listeners. I'm originally from Soviet Union, and I thought I'd just throw it out there because I'm an immigrant, right? Like I came to this country with my family with nothing. I was a young child, and I have a lot to give back to my family for putting me through school and college and finally getting my master's and stuff. So I have that immigrant entrepreneurial strength. A lot of people who come to this country, their idea of the American dream is getting education and working for like a big $1 billion-trillion company, and kind of getting lost in the weeds of things in that company because you're looking at like hundreds of other people who do the same thing that you do. And the reason they have that is because they are such a large corporation. They need multiple of people like me to help run their company. And I think I just came to a point where I was like, you know what? I think I'm an entrepreneur because I've always had that, like, I could never sit still and do one project at a time. Like I'd always take breaks and like walk around and procrastinate and do little things on the side and write little notes and whatnot. And so eventually I just kind of was like, I'm going to open up my own company. And this happened in 2019 when the company I was working for, I did an audit for them. I performed an audit for them for a really big company. And then they like laid off a bunch of people. It was just like a big surprise. It was just like a kick in the butt, and I was like, I have to do something. Like, I can't keep doing this, like going through this process of like no securities, job security, as it felt like for me. And so I started my own company and I did fairly well. Like my first 3 years, I was like getting clients. I was partnering with companies like Agaris, who gives you clients. You basically share profits and they give you clients. And, the more I did it, the more I realized that there's people who are in need of tax help. And the tax help that I was providing was for real estate investors. And real estate kind of blew up in 2020. It became like a real
and a question just out of curiosity for folks listening, because I think you're right on track. I believe in my wife being an immigrant to the United States as well. The idea like coming here, like there's an entrepreneurial spirit about getting out there and doing something, right? So, but you're all right. I do know immigrants who like, just give me a city job and leave me alone for the rest of my life, right? But how long after you came here were you like, I'm going to start this business? Were you already in the finance space beforehand, or, was that something that you picked up when you came to the States?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I was 8 when I came to the States. So I was doing just the general.
Weren't starting the business yet.
When I went to DePaul University, it's a big business school here in Chicago. that's when I was like, I'm going to study finance. I'm going to study accounting. It was more like a lot of the people that I went to school with, they were all striving towards the same goal, finance and accounting. And so I kind
Yeah.
of followed along that stream of like, my friends and colleagues who were doing the same thing. Um,
Hmm.
and then I started working. I worked for a hedge fund firm when I first got out of college. And then I worked for nonprofit. I worked in education. And then I spent a span of my career. I was in finance, corporate finance accounting for 18 years before I started
Mm.
my own company. So I worked in manufacturing for a long time. I worked for a company that manufactures like Coca-Cola cans, like aluminum Coca, like they make the cans
Yeah.
for Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Fanta. Like we always had all the pops in our refrigerator and in the office and stuff. Um, I worked for a company called Siemens. I'm sure you're familiar with them, a big tech firm. They're
Yeah.
Fortune 500. They've been around for hundreds of years.
Yeah. So you really made your way into the corporate world, which funny enough is so many people who come on the podcast, right? Very few people like come out the gate of college like I'm starting my own business because you really don't know what the world's like out there. So you live the corporate finance life for a while before you realize, whoo, right? You said it back to your original story, you needed that security, and I think that you found it in yourself. You found that you relying more on you was more secure than the big billion-dollar companies making the decisions for you.
Yeah, but I owe it to these
Okay.
billion-dollar companies because I wouldn't be able, like, if I'm
Correct.
a finance consultant, technically. Like my company is called Virtual CFO Pros. I provide CFO services and tax advisory to clients. But I'm a finance consultant. When I come into
Yeah.
a small business to help them with their finance accounting, to them, I'm just a consultant, right? And that is the typical kind of gateway into entrepreneurship when you've been in corporate for 20 years. That is the finance consultant, the accounting consultant, the marketing consultant, doing those things it just makes more sense. Like I didn't go into a product company. I didn't start a product. I did a service firm, which I was familiar with. I've done all
Hmm.
the finance work. I know how to do it. Now, how can I do it at a high level and impact the bottom line of small businesses locally and nationwide? Like that was my whole goal. That's what I did.
No, and that's great. And we've had a few fractional CFOs on the podcast, as well as we actually have a couple fractional CFOs who are clients at telehelping. And I'm curious, as I always am, Brian. I have not asked this question to a fractional CFO. Is my general thought process, because I also do fractional CMO work on occasion to entertain myself when I get a bored moment. What you know, my traditional thought process is a CFO is like a card, what I refer to as a card holder, like, they have like a company credit card. You know, how does a fractional CFO and what type of businesses do you find yourself working with in terms of size? What is your initial responsibilities when you go inside of a company?
Well, I've worked with middle market companies, which are like 50 million and up. It just depends. A lot of these real estate investment firms that I work with, they're individually owned or they might be husband and wife, kind of a balance between the two. They run the company together. Um,
Hmm.
y- they can be mid-market. A lot of them are mid-market companies because they are, in like the 50 million and up range. But I do work with the smaller businesses. I work with a brokerage. Um, I worked with them last year and I happen to work with them this year too, where I came in and did some metrics for them to try to minimize some of the costs that their spend, for example. They were losing money and they needed to see where it was coming from. And that was a smaller company. I mean, like a brokerage firm that size, it was about 5 million. So they're small business. Now, anything up to like 50 million is still considered small business. I don't know. I think, when I have to sift through 20 million of revenue to make a decision on cost reduction, I think that's a pretty big project. So I would think of it as a large
Yeah.
company, but in terms of how the SEC kind of values companies across the nation, 50 million is considered mid-market, and I have worked with a mid-market company.
Yeah, that's so interesting you say that, because when we do talk about revenue, it doesn't always translate to industries as well. Real estate being a very high value, high cap type of market, it can get really high really quick. Where I, did some consulting recently with a painting organization, a accounting organization in the painting industry. And they see organizations that are good size. A good size business was around a million, right? And so, when they hear about a $15 million company, they're like, whoa, a $15 million company, that's huge. And they're like, well, it depends on the industry. That a $15 million company in some industries is so insignificant. It's a rounding error on a calculator. And so, I think that from that perspective, when we're talking about that, yes, 50 millions is huge. But for real estate, it can be quite small. That's why you saw the brokerage around 5 million. That's interesting that you do that. Now, do you come in are you a one woman army, or do you have like a team of bookkeepers and folks that help you out to help you, do these consultings? Or are you just like, lone survivor over here?
That's a great question. So it depends. If it's a local project, I'll usually come in by myself, and then I will outsource any of the activity that I need to. Um, I do have one accountant that I work with. He's in Texas. He's on my staff that helps me usually during like tax season mostly, and some one-offs during the year as well. I used to outsource all the bookkeeping to like a company in India or something, and they charge like $5 an hour, something like crazy. And
Yeah.
I did that when I had a lot of bookkeeping clients. Now I try to manage it on my own just to save some of the costs,
Yeah.
but also because it gets really cumbersome when you're including people from like offshore in a lot of the activity that's happening here. And it just, a lot of my customers even like it that if it's only me involved in their QuickBooks or Buildium or whatever I'm working on, um, just for security purposes. And it's a lot of very sensitive information. So they tend to
Of
like it if
course.
it's just me.
That makes sense. We see a lot of, around like the January timeframe, actually December, we see a very large rise in some of our accounting space probably grows 30% during this time period. So we'll have folks hire for the next 6 months, and they'll bring on more bookkeepers and stuff because we're out of Mexico. From like December, they'll start searching, and then they'll hire them in January, and they'll keep them until, May, right? Some of them stay on afterwards because, I imagine the amount of people who did zero bookkeeping throughout the year need cleanups. And so they're going in there and they're trying to do all those bookkeeping. So that's a great perspective. And, I do want to shift gears real quick and kind of understand, you, right? Well, we have this, young immigrant who moved to the United States from the USSR. And so you came here, got into accounting, worked in corporate, starting a business. Great. Like that's a really pretty picture. Who are you though? So we know you live in Chicago, right? Have you always lived in Chicago, right? Are you a cold person? Are you a warm person? Like, who are you?
Oh, that's really sweet of you to ask, to be interested in me. I live here by myself. I had a dog. I actually lost my dog this year. It was really sad. I'm still
Oh,
very crushed by it. And I'm just like a typical person, my day to day includes, like working out, meditating, doing some work related to QuickBooks, or I might be working in Buildium. Like right now, I'm working on an expense budget for somebody. I'm doing taxes for somebody else. So my day to day, like I would be in my home office working. I take webinars. I do everything for my company. I do all the sales calls. I do all the marketing.
that's great.
Yeah, I even do like, if you think about it, I do all the bookkeeping and all the financials and accounting that I have to do. I do all of that. So I'm on my own there, but my company does other things other than just, your technical accounting work. Like, I appear on podcasts and I talk to numbers of people. Yeah, on LinkedIn and Facebook. I'm very active in social media. I also have a service line on my company where we provide capital. So like if you're a business owner and you're trying to raise money to buy a new computer, you're growing your business, you're buying a plant, you're a manufacturer, and I help you basically raise money, raise capital for that business with my capital partners. So that's another service line that I provide that I work on from time to time as well.
So you are what we would call an all-encompassing entrepreneur. Like you're in it, right? It's actually the photo you've painted is quite common to the people I actually work with at telehelping every day. I think 80% of our clients, when they come to us, they're doing everything by themselves, which is great. I did the same thing at telehelping. I actually did most of everything. And I kind of miss it sometimes because you get used to doing it all by yourself. And then, there's like this, like when you do get to the point where you're like handing it off or having someone else do something else for you, it almost feels like, well, what do I do now? Like, and then you have to like shift gears. And so, I myself, all I do is our sales calls. That's all I do is sales calls and this podcast. So that's like, this is a project for me. And then I was like, I want to do a podcast. And because I had so much extra time and I just do sales calls most of my day. And so I've gone through and I've handed off everything. Fun fact, if you're messaging me on LinkedIn, most of the time it's not even me unless, I've taken over the conversation. So which, oftentimes when someone says they want to be on my podcast, I take over the conversation. So I live on LinkedIn as well, but I never log into any of our social medias. So I usually shun social media unless it's for the podcast or work.
All right.
But that's great. Well, so, so you didn't answer the question in terms of, so when you immigrate here, I guess you've kind of lived in Chicago forever. So you're what do they call Chicago people?
Chicagoan.
Chicagoans?
Yeah.
Chicagoans?
Yeah.
And so
I
you've
lived
lived in Chicago forever.
Yeah.
Do you want to live in Chicago forever? You just like it that much? I heard the winters there are frigid.
I've traveled a lot, like in the States too. I've been to a lot of different states. I think if I had a choice to live somewhere else, I'd probably pick like the West Coast, like maybe somewhere in California or Colorado or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does help out if you're working with multi time zone clients, working on the West Coast is kind of nice. And so unless you're a late night person, right? I know some East Coast folks who have no problem working late into the evenings as their West Coast partners are closing down their days. But it does make it easier. I'm a morning person, so I like when the East Coast is done and leaves me alone at 2 p.m. And so, but we also have some clients in Europe, and so I have to play time zone tag with them sometimes. So that can be difficult, but yeah, no, the West Coast does make that much easier. I think what's an interesting element of you yourself and a topic that finds itself in the center stage of the United States right now is immigration, right? And so with you being an immigrant entrepreneur, do you find that during this time, are you bothered by maybe the United States' approach to immigration? And is that something that's in the forefront of your mind and thought processes as someone who yourself is an immigrant of the United States?
You
Well, now
know,
you're a citizen now, but yes.
it's a very different immigration when you think about the 90s and when USSR broke off and they finally started letting Russians basically into the United States, because when we immigrated in 91, USSR was still the USSR. And then like right when we were immigrating, like right before, it became Belarus, like when it all changed and became its own countries. So it was a really
Mhm.
different dynamic. Plus we had to do a lot of paperwork and have proper documentation to fly
Yeah.
from one country to the other. And we didn't fly into Chicago, we flew into New York. So, and then we had to take another flight. So it's a little bit of a different dynamic. It was just as hard. I think I was very young and I had a hard time just with the process of like moving from one country to the next, all in one night, right? Like we took a bus, we got
Yeah.
to Moscow, we we took a flight, we got to Germany, we took another flight, like it's really hard on a young kid and even adults too. As far as what's happening now, I think that walking into the country when there's no immigration laws is bad because there has to be kind of a security point for immigrants. Now, that's not to say that people shouldn't be allowed to immigrate. I immigrated
Right. Yeah.
and this is the greatest country in the world. The opportunity we started out talking about entrepreneurship, I would never be at a point where I'm now sitting here with you, even if I lived in another country and we were able to do this digitally, there's no way that we would ever meet. I would have never strived this far to become who I am today because I wouldn't know anything other than what I knew in my country. And that's one of the things
No.
that makes our country so great. And
Well said.
people should be able to experience the right way.
Well said. It's interesting you say it too, because my wife being an immigrant and we have immigrant friends, actually, all of our friends immigrated to the United States that I know. And, they hold the same belief. A lot of the 90s, even 90s Mexican immigrants or Latin immigrants as a whole, there are some, I'm not speaking for everybody, but their belief from what they've shared with me is that, whoa, 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 I didn't walk in here that way, or if, I didn't have the benefits in the process that you had, you shouldn't have this kind of thing. Like there's a process to this, you should do the process. It didn't go that way for me. So it shouldn't go that way for you is the mentality that some of them have. And it's actually quite interesting that the Latin community as a whole is very split on the matter. We like to see social media. Social media really pushes us a certain direction with its algorithm. But I agree. I quote a comedian. I think he's from the Western elements of Europe, and he's like, if you don't like United States, shut up. I'll take your papers. I think he's on. I think he's on Kill Tony, and he's hilarious. I can't remember where he's from specifically, but he's like, yeah, shut up. I'll take your papers. He's like, you're stupid, right? He's like to think that. This country's anything except amazing, and you're a beautiful example. And you're my 56th episode this year, right? And so I get to talk to 56 people this year, some of which who are immigrants. Just last week, spoke to a French immigrant who owns a restaurant in downtown LA. And he, expressed, right? His episode goes live today, actually. He was expressing like, you know, running a business is hard even when there's not riots outside my restaurant. And so he's like, please go riot somewhere else. And so he's like, he's all for like what they're trying to express. And he doesn't want to take that from him because he's also an immigrant, but there's a process for it. And I think that's always an interesting take. And I love the entrepreneurial spirit that comes with folks who have immigrated. Oftentimes it burns a little bit brighter than someone who's born into it.
Yeah, I think so. I think the work ethic of immigrants, I mean, this country was built on immigrants, and the work ethic
Yeah.
of immigrants is not, there's no comparison if you think about it, whether you're Latin American or you're Russian or you're Spanish or whatever your background is. I think it's just a matter of like, because people are so appreciative when they get to immigrate to a great country and they appreciate all the chance that they're given, that they don't take it for granted.
Yeah. No, I love that. And it's actually interesting too, because my family's Irish immigrants. I'm third generation at this point, right? So when they came here, my great grandfathers found their way into the United States. My family reminds us that they weren't welcome. My family was sent to coal mines, right? When they first got here. And the Irish, they were not beloved. The Italians were not beloved when they arrived. And I think that, it's just as times change, so does, sometimes the focus. And as the world economics change, right? We may see an influx of immigrants from the Middle East as humanitarian crises continue to change. And I think that those kind of shape the inflows and outflows of the American people, who are a body of immigrants. Everyone here is an immigrant. Unless you have some type of Native American inside you, you are an immigrant. Oh, and fun fact, Native Americans, they made their way from the land bridge from Russia and Asia, right? So it's actually quite interesting. Everyone at some point in time made their way to some place, and it basically flows for either, bless you, through weather phenomenons early in the nomadic periods, or through international crises like world wars and famine and regime changes. All these things take place all the time. And so I appreciate you for sharing that perspective. And, as we're getting ready to shift down here into lower gears, I'm interested if you would share, what is your client avatar for your organization, right? We have folks listening today, which is awesome about this podcast. We have a lot of folks who either get clients, business, or investors from this. If you were sitting here saying like, hey, if you're listening and you're like fit into this avatar, reach out to me. Who is your ideal client?
So my ideal client is a real estate investor or another business owner. Real estate investing is a business. Once you start buying multiple properties, if you've got rental properties, it has to be tracked as a business. And so I always say real estate investors and other business owners.
Wonderful. Yeah. And you said on the smaller side, it's around 5 million, but on the larger side, you see working with some $50 million. So in and around that range.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Irina, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you. I think that you offer a brilliant perspective from not only an entrepreneur, a woman, and an immigrant, as well as a finance expert and a survivor of the corporate world. And so I appreciate you. Welcome to the dark side, for representing everything that you do represent on my podcast today. And it's been an absolute pleasure having you. So thank you so much for being open and willing to have a conversation with me.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had a great time. Thank you so much for having me on.
No worries. Have a great day.
This video was brought to you by our official sponsor, Telehelping. Need support for your business? Telehelping connects you with top-tier remote staff to help you streamline operations and fuel growth. Go to telehelping.com and get started today.